Hey, Jenna.
Hey, Dom. What's going on?
We're gonna talk about a couple of things today on the show. One topic we're gonna get into is how much the public really trusts the media.
They don't. I tell you right now, they don't. They don't trust us. They
Why
think
don't
we're
they trust us?
Well, I don't know. I guess this article's going to tell us, but like, girl, what? If people knew the amount of work that goes into producing a segment that nobody watches. Oh,
What
I
else? What
know.
else are we gonna
As we
talk
both
about?
sigh. Oh, God.
What else are we gonna talk
We're
about?
also going to talk to my friend and former colleague, Yasmeen Khan. She is a professional podcaster, meaning she gets paid. And but she's been producing audio stories for years and years and years. And she's going to give us some tips and pointers and also explain how journalism works in the audio medium. So let's get started.
Sounds good.
Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. All right, so tell me about this Fakakta article because there's a part of me that's just like, well, duh, they don't trust us.
Uh, so it's Gallup recently did a poll, and um, the title was Americans' Trust in Media Remains at Trend Low. It's a recent Gallup poll basically was saying the trust in mass media, such as, newspapers, TV, and radio, remains at a record low, which is that only 31% of Americans express a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the media to report the news accurately and fairly. It's kind of consistent to last year's numbers, which were at 32%, but it's a steep decline from trust levels that peaked back in the 1970s, where the trust level was around at 68 to 72%.
When you say the 1970s, are we talking pre or post Watergate? Because I feel like that's when stuff started to
Well,
deteriorate.
the first time Gallup asked this question was back in
Hmm.
1972. And it's been measuring it most years. I think it started going close to almost being yearly in 1997. Before then, it would like they would ask it every once in a while. But so yeah, that's when it was first
That was
asked.
around the time of
Yeah,
Watergate, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken.
yeah. So I don't know if it was exactly right after, but yeah, it's
I don't think it
I
wrapped up to the mid 70s, like the whole I'm resigning, not a crook thing. But yeah, okay. So that's when they started asking. And that's when I feel like, I mean, call me crazy, but I feel like I know how much you hate the generation wars. I feel like the boomers were raised and the silent generation, etc., were all raised with a certain level of trust in institutions that began
yeah.
to, like, once you got into definitely the 60s and then really in the 70s and then the 80s, like it just started to deteriorate and people had less and less trust in government institutions, in other like the church, all sorts of stuff.
Well, it's you know thinking back in that time period, though, it was the Walter Cronkite era, right? And
America's news daddy.
who basically was like, I'm telling you the truth. And I think people had more interest in trusting someone like that. You just listened and you're
Yeah.
like, maybe you wanted to trust that person because you wanted to believe you were getting that accurate information. But I do wonder at that time there was a lot of political infighting, like you were saying. Like Watergate was what, 72 to like 74. That probably changed. I mean, we've discussed this on outside. Like, I don't know if Nixon would have resigned if that happened today. If what he
Oh,
did back
today,
then,
no, you could spin
it's
that and yeah, no.
he
And you
would
get
have,
like an army of people behind you to spin, and you like vilify your enemy,
yes,
and you have a media machine to help you do it.
yeah. But I mean, it's interesting when you talk about just generationally. So they do have numbers. So they say older Americans who are 65 and older
Hmm.
um, express more trust in the media at 43% than those under 50, which is at 26%. So it
That's
goes
those of
exactly
us
to
who
what you're
were
saying.
born or came of age in the Reagan years.
It,
And we're not
they,
even going to get into like the 90s, what we
no,
all saw deteriorate during that decade.
so that was interesting. They says like, they mentioned something over here about how, so the 70s was when they were started asking this question, and then it said by Gallup's next readings, again, this is according to their press release slash article that they put out.
Hmm.
By Gallup's next readings in the late 90s and early 2000s, smaller majorities of 51% to 55% trusted the news media. So by the 90s and early 2000s, you're talking about already you've lost maybe, you know, 20% of favorability with people trusting you. And that was around the time of, of course, the scandal, Bill Clinton, the Oval Office. And then
Uh,
also you had the 2000 election,
oh
which
my God, yes, the hanging chads.
the
For
hanging
those of us
chads.
that had to cover that story.
Oh my goodness. I know there might be some people who aren't familiar with it, but I mean, that was a crazy time in terms of, I forget how long exactly we waited
It
for those
felt like
hanging chads.
eternity, but then again, I was a production assistant at the time, so it would have felt like an eternity.
But so, um, I think that, this is something that, again, really brought about a, a lot of distrust in the
Yeah.
media and what was being reported and
Hmm.
who was telling you, no, it's accurate. And it was also a big time of talk radio. So you had a lot of opinion
Oh, that's right.
people.
That stuff really started to rise. And that's also, as we learned from our earlier guest, Margot Suska, local newspapers, as they started to decline and go away, um, that what filled that gap for a lot of people was talk radio, which would basically just give very slanted opinion and sprinkle it with maybe some weather and traffic. So it seems like the news, but
Exactly.
it's not news. Yeah.
No, but you're speaking to an audience that really is passionate because you're speaking to their issues. So
And you're
it's
also speaking in a fearful tone because that will keep an audience
who
engaged.
doesn't love a film? Listen, that's a lot of, news, be it cable news or broadcast news. I mean, whether it's telling people about the weather, storms that are coming your way, or that's how you get people's attention is
I
by
will say
scaring them.
though, when it comes to climate change, though, I feel like be afraid. Yeah, you're a little late on that one.
It's so funny how people can get a little bit, that people can get bitter with that because they start questioning, like, whether it's about how many times and I'm guilty of this myself. You're like, sure. I feel like you guys are blowing this out of proportion with the weather. And, I'm not going to believe what you're saying or
Well, there's nothing worse than when they sound all the alarms, but then like the storm either takes a shift or a
exactly.
turn, or maybe it doesn't hit in the same with the same intensity that everybody thought it would. And of course, I'm now thinking of Hurricane Milton in
Mhm.
Florida, where there was storm surge, but it wasn't as much as predicted. So it only adds to this like, oh my God, you guys were totally blowing this out of proportion to get me to leave my home and all this home starter stuff kicks in and yeah.
Well, here are some other breakdowns. So, among the most trusted from this list,
Oh,
local government, which was at
okay.
67%.
I question how many people know what local government does, but okay.
State government, which is at
Again, I'm
55%,
gonna ask that question.
and the American people at 54%. So
Hold up. Wait.
they
Okay. Wait. Now, a few things here. One, as New Yorkers, trusting at least our state government feels a little wild. We are big on indicting and
Oh,
arresting
yes.
members of
I
the government. So that's kind of wild. But then two also is who do you, if you trust the American people, who do you think the press is made up of?
exactly. I think that, and over here, the American people as a whole, this is according to their question, as a whole, when it comes to making, they trust the American people as a whole when it comes to making judgments under our democratic system about the issues facing our country. Oh, I have questions about this.
Yeah.
um, and then among the least trusted, I have, of course, the media is the least trusted, and right above us, at
Mhm.
which we had 31%, and right above us is Congress that has 34%. So
Also
34,
made up of the American people. I mean,
yes,
don't get me wrong, largely the 1% of the American people, and that's a whole different discussion, but still, they're Americans too. Um, that's an interesting poll. I would
it is. It
love
is.
uh to have a chance to further unpack that, but we're
Mhm.
actually going to pivot and go to our conversation about audio storytelling with Yasmeen Khan. So it seems like everyone these days is starting or totally hosted their own podcast. In fact, I constantly see social media ads to start your own podcast today in just 3 easy steps. But what does it really mean to create a podcast? And what makes good, compelling audio storytelling or conversations? Now, Dom and I have a pretty vague idea of what that means by now, right, Dom?
Yeah, a little. Yeah.
Okay, all right. But we decided it would be helpful to consult an expert like Yasmeen Khan. Yasmeen has been a podcast writer, editor, and host for series like Childproof about how parents can navigate raising kids without losing themselves in the process. Here's a clip.
I don't mean the stories and hugs and kisses part of bedtime. I mean the period after dinner, leading to bedtime, where the energy goes up.
For heaven's sake, the butt smacker. Dino Show!
This is when my two daughters, who are 7 and almost 4, get super silly. Sometimes there's playing between sisters, sometimes fighting. There's lots of flopping around. I mean, it's regular kid energy. I just have a hard time with it. And I'm not even managing the kids by myself.
We will feel furious or wounded or whatever, and those are the strong negative feelings. But if we process those in the right way and give ourselves permission to hold a grudge, then what we end up with is we've processed all the negative emotion, and then the grudge becomes a sort of symbolic object that reminds you of what happened and what you learned from it and what you might need to bear in mind for the future.
She's separating the grudge event from the feelings. So there's the incident that makes you feel a certain way, annoyed, wronged, betrayed. Then you let yourself recognize all those feelings and what caused them. Hey, something happened and it mattered. You work through it. We'll get to details on how. And then what you're left with in the end is a grudge that Sophie calls a good grudge. It's been cleaned of all its stains and smells and shined up as a little keepsake.
Those were clips of Yasmeen's bedtime problem from the series Childproof, again, the podcast that she hosted, and also a clip from How to Hold a Grudge, an episode from the series More Than a Feeling. Both were produced by 10% Happier. Yasmeen has also been an editor on If Food Could Talk, a podcast from American Public Television, and a fill-in host for Slate's analysis podcast, What Next? It's quite the resume, and that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. So, welcome to our little podcast, Yasmeen.
Hello. Thank you both for having me.
Oh my God, this is like wonderful to have you on. Now, I should say that we do have history together. We've worked
Mhm.
in newsrooms at different organizations before, but for your own sense, like, how did you even come to audio storytelling?
I mean, it's the clips that you just played and the intro you just gave me actually just talks about the last couple of years of my life because, well, we worked together in public radio,
Mhm.
and that's basically how I got my start, in audio storytelling. I was a longtime news reporter, before that, a producer a news producer, working for 2 different public radio stations. So I spent 14 years working in public radio. And, it's this, there's like, I feel like something that people need to wrap their head around is the idea that even, producing short form news, feature stories, like all of that is audio storytelling also. It's giving people facts and information and telling people the news of the day. But I feel like, especially in the medium of audio, it really requires a storytelling component. Whether you're writing a 45-second newscast spot or doing a 4-minute feature or a series of 7-minute features or a 20-minute, episode of something. So that's the long answer. I got my start in audio storytelling, working in a newsroom and public radio. And I feel like, you use like different muscles, of course, when you're working maybe long form versus short form, but I developed, I feel like, a lot of the skills that I needed for, work in the podcast world and longer form storytelling as a reporter, as someone who had to do hundreds and hundreds of interviews of people, writing questions, thinking about the tape I needed, the sound I needed, what I needed to get people to say into a microphone,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how to structure a story, thinking about how to just get something down on paper, like writing script after script after script, So that's how I got started.
Well, that's really interesting because one of the things, and that you bring up so many like little subtle things, and I'm like, okay, I want to pull that out and pull that out and pull that out. But when it comes to the audio aspect of it, because this is something that I find myself kind of struggling to explain, is what makes storytelling different when you're just using the audio, or when the audience you're engaging with is just engaging through their ears. Like, there isn't anything already there for them to watch, with the exception of this podcast. Yes, we're on YouTube, but there isn't anything there for them to see. So you have to sort of, with their ears, create something in their mind's eye of the story that you're telling.
Right. I mean, that's the challenge and the power of audio, is that you have to get people to listen and pay attention. And I think you can do that, just because you have people's voices to work with. It is different. I mean, there are beautiful print writers, of course, who do wonderful storytelling. It's just like a different way of writing and maybe a different way of thinking. Like, reading a quote is different than hearing someone say it in their own voice and in that intonation. And obviously, like, words can be delivered just in very different ways. So hearing something, I think, is very powerful and just automatically very intimate if you are hearing someone talk. So what was the question? What was it?
The unique challenge, I guess, or what it is that makes audio storytelling different than the other mediums, like from video or from just print.
I've never worked in video, but I am an audio evangelist. I think it's the best medium. I mean, it's just what I'm happy working in. And also, I really like it as a consumer of news and information and stories. Um, and obviously, a lot of other people are now also, because podcasts have exploded. But well before podcasts, I was like, the kid who grew up and listening to, whose parents listened to NPR. And so I was like in the back seat, always hearing, listening. And I loved NPR. I still love NPR. So in terms of what's different, I mean, all I can say is, in terms of the just what audio is that, yes, you have to be able to, you have to do the reporting. Let's just start with this. Whether you're a print reporter or an audio reporter, you have to do the work you have to do the work of the journalism, right? Finding out what the story is, getting people to talk to you, having something to say, like, what's the bottom line. But then in terms of the craft of how you deliver it to an audience, it's just, you might have to structure it a little differently. Like, if you're getting an audience, if you have an audience who's only listening, can't throw too
Mhm.
many numbers at them. You have to, like, use very clear, direct language, conversational language, to talk to them. And that's also, to me, the power of audio. You have to understand an issue so well that you can break it down in real talk, you know? And that's how you sort of get people, an audience engaged. Um, it's different than when you're reading something and you can go back and say, oh, whose name was that again? Or like, who's, what was that number? Or you can put three numbers in a sentence and print, right? Because you were looking at it. So it's like, it's different in terms of how you can absorb it. So in audio, um, you have to really kind of hold the listener's hand and be a guide for them in how you deliver your stories.
Well, with that in mind, then, because going back to what I was saying at the top about so many people are just like, oh, you could totally start a podcast right now. And it's just so simple and just a few easy steps. And every time I see those ads, I'm always thinking, like, that's so not how any of this works at all. So, what would I guess you say are the important things to have in mind? Because one of the other things that I've learned from being in some of the like podcast chat rooms is that a lot of them, when people who don't have a background in journalism or audio, and they try to start one, apparently they have a fail rate of about 3 episodes. People get 3 episodes in, and then for whatever reason, they putter out, crap out, etc.
Yeah. I mean, yes, it is a running joke, as you said, I think at the beginning, that everybody has a podcast. Everybody's the host of a podcast. I mean, you can have two people having an interesting conversation, and that might land well. Maybe that might find an audience. I don't know. To me, producing audio journalism is thoughtful, careful work. So even if it is conversational and fun and chatty, there's a plan involved. And I mean, it kind of just depends on the kind of show you're producing, perhaps. If it's two people talking about sports or something, like maybe you can have a more off the cuff conversation. Maybe it's all opinion based and you're there for the personalities, right? But that's not the kind of work that I do necessarily. So the work that I do is more focused, obviously, on journalism, but also on the storytelling. Anytime you want to tell a story, it requires editing. It requires like shaping a story before you even turn on a microphone, and then editing it afterward. Just to like give something a narrative arc. You have to you're taking an audience with you on a little bit of a ride, right? So you want to have a point, and you also want to have I mean, in my view, you want to have people, like, the best case scenario in terms of audio storytelling is giving people a story that they're really engaged in, they're delighted by, perhaps they're hearing something new and different, and they're just like you're making them think a little differently or a little more openly about something that they've never heard before. So you have to have a landing point for your podcast episode, right? You can't just like turn on the microphone and just see where it takes you. You have to take the audience somewhere, and that requires some careful work and planning.
So, Yasmeen, I'm interested in hearing also about for people who are new, let's say there are people who think they want to get involved with putting together a podcast, telling a story. What are things that people can do? Because I know some people feel like, I don't know if I can actually do that. Can I tell a story myself? Like, am I able to do that? And just like oftentimes many people will say, like, what makes a good story too. So what would you tell people in terms of if you want to try this out, even whether it's for a business venture or for even a personal venture, what would you tell people to try and do the steps to take and sort of what makes a good story and also how they can sort of translate that story to audio?
I mean, that's a great question, because I think even for people who aren't just starting out, there's always the question of like, is this a story? Is this a good story? Is this like, how do we tell this story? I mean, for someone who's wanting to try this out, say, I would say the first thing to think about, in my view, is authenticity. So you want to tell a story, say it's a personal story, right? you want to interview an elder relative about family history or something like that, or just maybe you have your own personal story to tell about identity or something like that. I think what people will be able to hear is if a story is inauthentic to you. So I think that you want to just I would promote first some earnest introspection about like why you want to tell the story you want to tell, why it's important to you, and why it like keeps buzzing in your head a little bit, even if you're not sure that there's a whole story there yet. Like, what is it that makes you want to like explore this topic? Or, maybe it's just like a community issue. The bodega on your corner is new owners, and there's, I don't know, neighborhood tension around it or something. Right? Like, just like think about why the story is interesting to you so you can like tease out maybe what there is to say. The other thing is, it's always good to have a story like audio stories, like movement and action. Like, you don't want to just describe something. You want to be able to go out and conduct interviews or just like go get tape of something happening. So it's always, I think, a story where you're following someone doing something is always a good story, right? Because like somebody is trying to accomplish something, and then you can decide if like somebody gets there at the end. And then like if you take a story like I don't know, can like going to get a new passport, right? This is very boring. This is not necessarily a story, but like you can follow somebody going through the steps of like doing it. Like, where are you going? Why do you need this passport? Like filling out the paperwork, or like it's really late. You need the passport in 1 week, like going to the federal building, and like doing it in person, and then like getting it in the end, right? There's an outcome. But then the last thing, it's maybe the first thing you should think about, but like in like sort of at the end of the story or along the way, like the story should have some meaning. Like, it's not just that, like, this is what happened. The story is about my getting a passport. No, actually, the story is about my absolute need to travel somewhere. Like, the story is about my quest to go to Ireland to find my great grandparents' grave, or you know what I mean? Like, there's something else that is like driving you to do this other mundane thing, maybe. And I think like there has to be a really sort of central human element involved. That's the thing that's relatable to listeners. It's not like someone's going to be like, "Oh, yes, I mean, maybe they might like, I remember when I applied for a passport." But it's like that sort of human thing of like, yeah, I get that need and that drive. That's the best part about journalism in general, I think, but also particularly audio journalism, is that how it can connect people with all these sort of just human desires and drives that we have.
The connecting part, I think, is always so important because that's the part that people can relate to for themselves and with somebody else. I mean, I guess the thing that you also talked about authenticity and people needing to sort of be real. How important? I mean, sometimes that could be really complicated. What's something would you recommend if somebody's trying to tell a certain story, making sure that also as a journalist you're not part of the story? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you're telling that person's story. What's how? Sometimes that can be a little bit. It can get tricky because I know I've gotten that space too, where it's like I'm putting my experience on something that you know what I mean. Like I have a
Right.
certain perspective.
I guess by authenticity, I actually just mean like genuine curiosity. And sometimes that might mean like you are part of the story, say if it is a personal story. But if it's a piece of journalism, and you are going sort of as an outsider to a community or just like following an issue or something in politics or whatever, I think that listeners will be able to hear, I think, if there is like a real genuine curiosity that's driving the questions. I think when that happens, you're working on behalf of the audience also. Um, I think also listeners will be able to hear if that's absent. How they might hear it, I don't know, but like it just I think when there is that sort of real sense of curiosity, you sort of you come up with better questions. And you actually, when you have that curiosity, you might sort of be able to, you might not like have that sort of specific point of view that you're trying to get across, as opposed to if you have a particular lens that maybe you want to push or something, then that's something where I guess maybe you wouldn't be coming at it from genuine curiosity. You're trying to sort of maybe push a point of view. I can't really think of examples
No,
of
that's
that,
fine.
but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because what I'm thinking as I'm hearing you say that, especially when it comes to, asking better questions, is, this concept of advocating for your audience, of, you being the one driving the conversation. And again, this is if you're interviewing a source for a story that's going to be like a reported package, or even if you're just leading like a conversation interview, that you're you're considering who your audience is and what they may or may not be wondering, and you're driving your questions based on that, but also based on your own curiosity. That is very clear, like if you are genuinely interested in something, or if you're not.
Yes. And that is, I think, tough, time consuming work, because
Oh
it
yeah.
means that you're taking an issue and looking at it from all sides, which is, I think, what journalists are supposed to do. And you have to really examine something, because you're not just asking questions of one person, you're asking questions of multiple people who have maybe different stakes in an issue. But yeah, I think that definitely, good reporting comes from asking good questions. And that's how you get an audio. That's how you get good tape.
All right. Well, one of the other things that we wanted to kind of get into is when you're editing a piece, what exactly is it that you're listening for? Or I guess what constitutes going into editing an audio piece? Like, obviously, there's superfluous tape that you're going to cut out because this isn't necessary, but is there, I guess, are you making sure that whatever the piece is, and you sort of talked about this before, that it's carrying the audience all the way through, that there's a through line through the whole thing, or not? I mean, I'm guessing because I've tried editing stuff on my own, but of course we all know the writer who edits their own work has a fool for a client.
I mean, editing to me starts with just like conceiving of ideas, even for an episode, or what's trying to like come up with even like the kernel of a story. And then it proceeds to, who do we talk to? That's, I think, what an editor does, is helping a reporter or a producer come up with who's the right person to talk to, and what are the questions we need to ask them, and in what order. Like I am a firm believer in interview prep. Like, it might take me hours to write questions, and because I want to think about, like, well, one, I want to have already a wealth of information of maybe what this person's about,
Hmm.
this, whether it's an expert or someone we're asking a bunch of personal questions of. And I want to know what they've said on the issue already. I just want to have in the back of my mind. And then I want to go and ask really good questions. I need to get the basics, right? You need to get like maybe the plot points of your story. And then you need to ask those questions, just sort of drawing out meaning. And then you have tape. And then you have, it just sort of depends on the story you're telling. So
Of
let's take like
course.
a narrative interview, say, since we're already talking about an interview. Um, then, in terms of crafting an episode and working with a producer, a reporter, um, I would, so we've already done all this work about like, what's our story about? And like, we chose the right, who we think is maybe the right person to talk to. We got the tape we need. And now it's about shaping it for the audience and just really thinking about, one, how to set up, what is the big question,
Yeah.
of our episode? How are we going to hook people? What's like the juicy piece of tape at the beginning that we want people to hear, that sort of like is maybe a small detail, but really like demonstrates this bigger idea that we're about to talk about for the next 20 minutes. And then we can go into like just the rest of our interview, which might be some like nice table setting, getting to know the person we're interviewing, you know, whatever we need to hear from that person to
Mhm.
sort of set us up for sort of the rest of the arc of the story. And then, the things that I would be listening for, um, I'd be listening for, let's just like basic repetition, fat, places where we really need to actually dwell in some details, right? Like we have an idea of like the big ideas we want to get across, maybe in our episode, but you need to make things small also for listeners. Like people need like anecdotes and details to sort of like to hear, to really like kind of sink their claws into, right? Like those are the details of like life and story. And like that's how you kind of get people following along with you. Um, and so I would think about like where we want like the places in someone's story that we want to like really dwell and stop and like sit in someone's like an anecdote, a part of, someone's life, a time when they went to college and why that matters so much later there. And then we have to figure out the other parts of an interview that we can kind of like skim through or cut out and just like maybe the host or someone would come in with some narration giving just some like plot points to help connect some like one chunk of tape to another chunk of tape. So you are making decisions for the audience of like what they need to hear, really, and what you think might hold their interest, and what will really authentically tell this other person's story. And then it has to lead somewhere, like we spoke about, right? Like you want to sort of, you're like taking listeners on this little journey ride with you, and then you got to land somewhere, either with like your bigger idea, or just, a reflection from someone. Like that's sort of a classic narrative interview structure. And hopefully you're revealing some new details and about someone's life and also allowing listeners, people to connect with that story, that person's story. Even if their life is nothing like that person's life, the idea is there's a connection being made.
Quick question here, though, too. Like, just in terms of when you're the journalist asking these questions, is when you are going and maybe you have a certain idea of what you want to hear, there are ethics involved too in terms of how the person tells a story. I've heard people do this sometimes where maybe they want a certain emotion or they want to hear a certain, how do you as a journalist sort of work through asking questions that sort of get to the point of what you want to make with that story? Like, if you're hearing a story, you're talking to somebody and you're like, this would be more powerful if I heard you say it this way. Do you know what I mean? It's like I find it
How
interesting
do you
because
not manipulate?
yeah, how do you not? Basically, yes. How do you not? Because I think sometimes that's where I think I've gotten squishy with some people who will say, they'll have people redo answers. Like, I want to hear. Could you try it saying it this way? Or could you try saying it this way? Because they want to audibly, they want to hear something different. How do
I would never do that.
I would never do that either.
see? Because I feel like that's when you start making people repeat lines, it starts feeling like it's a script then.
Yeah, I would never ever make someone repeat lines that I'm interviewing unless it's like someone I work with and they're
Right.
part of the production process and part of
Right.
the game, so to speak. I mean,
Like tracking the
you
script or
you
something.
can ask the question a different way.
Right.
I mean, the same question essentially. Or so a trick for okay, just like in practical terms.
Right.
You did a pre-interview with someone and they were like all so passionate and everything, right? Talking about blah 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 blah. And then in the interview, they're not as much.
Yeah.
That's hard. And you need to go back and ask the question in a different way. And sometimes I would stop and say, well, you told us before, or like when you spoke to our producer or whatever, like you mentioned this. Can you like stop and talk about this? Like I think you have to try to get someone out of their own head a little bit in an interview. I mean, this is maybe just about also making someone feel comfortable talking, right? Like there has to be a sense of trust between, and it depends on the story, but say you're trying to get someone to talk about an emotional issue. Like that's very sensitive. Like why should that person open up to you in front of a microphone, right? So I think like just coming at it one with from the journalist perspective, from the interviewer's perspective, like coming at it with some humility and some understanding that like someone is opening up to you. And just like, so you have to be prepared to like, one, maybe let someone talk and give an answer. And then your interview might just take a little while because you want to go back and like piece by piece, talk about it again, piece by piece, maybe get someone in a scene that they remember, like try to get someone like really like get it concrete. Well, like you mentioned this when you were in school. Can you just like take me back? Like, what was it like sitting in that classroom or when you lived in that dorm and you were said you blah blah blah, like really like trying to be in the scene and get someone in that space. You can also, so I think though, from a production standpoint and a journalism standpoint, it is okay to let a guest know what to expect during an interview and to let them fill them in on what you are hoping to get out of the interview. I think, I mean, you don't want to leave them, like, you don't want to have them feel like they're giving an inauthentic answer. You never want someone to like put on emotion where it's not there. The idea is you're trying to help someone express their true emotions or feelings or whatever. And so you're trying to create a space where they feel comfortable doing that. I think, and this is like weird, right? We're talking into microphones and wearing headphones, and you're asking people maybe to, right, download a new program so they can record blah blah blah. So it's all, there's like technical stuff involved. You want it to feel like two people just talking in a living room in the end, but that's not what's happening in the moment. So I think it's okay to give people some direction and some, like, even you could have someone like listen to an episode of your show that you thought went really well, and to be like, to give an example of like what something might sound like in the end. Or I tell people, all the time, even in the news interviews I've done for What Next, I'm just like, you're going to hear me probably ask the same questions over and over again. Like, I'm going to make you repeat yourself because we like to have things unfold in a particular order. And of course, it's like the person being interviewed doesn't know when to not say something yet, like that we're going to get to it later. So, right, it's okay to like just say up front, like, thanks for tolerating my asking questions a couple of different ways. It might sound weird, but just totally like don't censor yourself. We'll worry about it in the edit at the end. But yes, you might hear me like ask something over. So one, giving people a little direction, I think is okay. And then just another trick, I don't know, it's not a trick. At the end of the interview, circle back and be like, so it's like, I have had so many interviews, whether it's like as a news reporter, doing like more deeply personal interviews, like stuff for Childproof or what, even the Grudges, episode, where someone gives like a whole big long answer. And then you say, well, is there anything else to add about that? Because, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like, they're like, yeah, I don't know. But da 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 da, and then they give the answer again. And it's just like sort of somehow more lively and even maybe more succinct. And you're like, you just give people a chance, to express. It's like, I mean, how crappy is it to give someone one shot to
No,
like
that's
say
so
what they want to
true.
say?
I've had so many interviews that I've done where I was out reporting or something, and I don't know why this happens, but like, everything that you're talking about, I'll ask the question a couple of different ways because I know we're going to go back and edit, to get the best piece, etc. But then I'll wrap the interview, and then
Yeah.
suddenly I will get the best conversation out of whoever my guest is.
Right.
And I'm just like, what? Oh my God, why are we not recording this? Why did you say
So
that?
I never turn off my recorder after I say thank you.
Oh,
Because that is like
I've been
that's
making
like
that
when
mistake
someone's
for
like, oh,
years.
that's when like they might just throw out all these gems or,
Every single time, every single time.
And I wouldn't hide that from someone. I wouldn't like put the microphone away or whatever, I would just still hold up and be like, thanks so much. This was great.
And it's also important
Like,
if you're
can you
going to,
believe that?
if you tell people, so, or so too, like sometimes we'll say, okay, we're done with recording. We'll say, okay, we're going to stop recording now. Like as a journalist or even as somebody who's a storyteller, it's like, to me, that makes sense because at a certain point, you're like, okay, like once you're taking or miking somebody, once you're telling them you're taking it off, then that's setting the pres like, no, we're done. The interview's done. But until then, honestly, that's a great technique for people to understand too. Because like Jenna said, we actually did that, right, Jenna? We had that with a recent guest that we recorded.
Oh
We had a
my
great
God.
conversation with him. And then at the end, we were just wrapping up. We finished. We were wrapping up talking. And then he was like, oh, why didn't you guys ask me about that thing? And we're like, I forgot we were like, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
let's
And
go back and hit record.
we just hit record again. So sometimes it is that
Yeah.
simple thing of just not but also just to hit back to like sometimes I feel like when you do pre-interviews, people are more relaxed when you're doing a pre-interview because they know it's not being recorded. So when you do the
Yeah.
research or if you're doing pre-interviews with a guest, a specific type of guest, they can feel so much more willing to sort of just not feel as they're more uninhibited in terms of how they're sharing their story. And maybe that's part of when you are interviewing somebody is sort of not right away getting to the first question. Like you want to build up to if you know that there's an emotional part of their show that they want to tell.
Yeah.
You don't just start out. It's not the first question you ask. It's something that you build up to so that they have a chance to feel comfortable because they know they now are being recorded, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, also, I mean, especially when you are asking someone knowingly to share a difficult part of their past. Certainly also trauma and things like that. I mean, that's a sort of whole other conversation maybe about how to interview people who have suffered trauma and who are maybe going to speak about it publicly, is how to do that in a sensitive way where you're not having someone relive something needlessly. And you want to be really careful about that. But say you are having someone talk about just a sensitive subject that is not traumatic. A mistake. I'll just use myself as an example, like the putting my kids to bed episode, my Yasmeen's bedtime problem, right? Where the whole episode is about basically how not to lose your cool with your kids.
Mhm.
And right, bedtime was like a time of day where I would just kind of unravel myself as my kids were unraveling. This was, by the way, back when I was working in a newsroom. And it's like, so having to like speak about something that's really sensitive, maybe a little embarrassing, like you want to be able to trust the person you're speaking to, but also trust that the final story is going to represent your experience and who you are. And that kind of takes, this is where it's a little maybe tricky in journalism, but I do believe that journalism is a two-way street. I think that for certain types of interviews, you do need buy-in from the person you're interviewing. Buy-in meaning they understand what they're in for. They understand that they are sharing something that's going to be shared with the world. I mean, that goes for everybody. But also that they, it's not that they're going to have a say in your final product, but you need to really, I think, represent to that person before the interview what you intend the story to be. Because I think, it might, you need that type of buy-in from someone you're interviewing about a sensitive subject so that they feel open and so that they feel like they understand where you're going with things. I'm going to stop there because I feel like that's a really thorny subject in journalism, but I think that is when you're talking about having someone open up. I think
No,
it's
I think
important
that's
that they just
incredibly
know where you're
important.
going with it.
I think that misunderstanding that process is where the pejorative phrase of gotcha journalism came from. So yeah, no, I think that's incredibly important. Um, one of the things that also happens in broadcast is that we are beholden to the clock. And so we are coming up on the end of our time together. And We always end all of our interviews by asking our guests how they came to journalism. How did you know this is what you wanted to do? You told us at the top of the show how you became an audio journalist, but just a storyteller and a journalist. How did you just land on that as a career?
I always loved public radio. I mean, let me just start by saying I went to school for journalism. Not everybody goes to school for journalism, but I did a master's degree for medical journalism. I thought I was going to be a public health reporter, and I was really interested in public health. I worked in public health before I went to journalism school, and I thought I would get an MPH, and do program work or whatever. But I decided there were a couple of specific pieces of journalism, medical journalism, that I read when I was working in public health, living abroad actually at the time, working for this international health organization. And I was like, oh, I want to write about it. I don't want to do the program work. I want to write about health issues. But remember, I was the kid also who grew up, listening to NPR in the backseat. And I always loved public radio. So when I was in grad school, I got a medical journalism reporting fellowship at North Carolina Public Radio, where I got my start. And then I loved working in public radio so much. I just applied for the first job that opened. And I've just been doing sort of radio journalism ever since. I'm still that kind of, I think in that way. I'm like a sort of social science thinker, I'm not the news reporter that's like, I wasn't the person getting scoops and like, I wasn't like following politics and power. I was like reporting on systems and how they like bump up against each other. And I loved, going in the weeds on like big policy issues that just did not make sense to the public at all. So I guess that's like how I came to it in the end. The other thing I'll just say is that the seed for that was always there, maybe, and I wasn't acknowledging it because I really loved Charles Kuralt. As a kid, I wanted to, like when I was probably like in the 6th grade, maybe, I wanted to like co-host CBS Sunday Morning with him. And I got to meet him once a little later. And he had like just announced his retirement, but I like went to hear him speak. I have a picture of me as maybe like a 8th grader, 9th grader meeting him. And then when I went to journalism school, by the way, that's so he died. I went to journalism school at UNC. I'm from Chapel Hill. And my interview for the program was because he's from North Carolina. He also went to I guess he went to UNC. Anyway, they recreated his office from CBS at UNC at the J School there. And my interview for journalism school was in that room. So it just all comes, it was all, I guess, meant to be. I don't know. And here I am doing it. Trying.
Here we all are still doing it, still finding a way. Yasmeen, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. And it's also been, I think, really eye-opening and refreshing because you mentioned some tricks of the trade that, 20 years in that I'm like, oh, I should probably do it that way. So
yeah,
it always helps.
We all need to practice.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.